Well, hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome to week 3 of our summer series on King David. We've been going through this series looking at different phases of his life and how in each phase of his life he was a man after God's own heart. What character traits, what things were inherent in him at each section of his life from birth to death that allowed him to be called that, and how we can then emulate those things, take those values and make them our own. And so week 1, we talked about David as a shepherd. Last week, we talked about David as a warrior. And this week, we're talking about David as a king, right? King David. And, you know, in the United States, we're not really big on kings unless you're talking about LeBron James. Usually, you're not talking very favorably about a king, right? You have the kings in England, which unless you like the Hamilton version that's kind of sassy, they seem like a bunch of guys who tax everyone, don't care about their citizens, and oppress their people. We aren't huge on kings. And that idea isn't unfounded, right? That kings do have kind of a history of being more about themselves than for the good of their people. Not all kings, but most kings end up having that reputation by the end of it, depending on how long they live as a king. And for the nation of Israel, they weren't actually even supposed to have a king. God was supposed to be their king. They are a theocracy, not a monarchy, right? So God is in charge, a monarch is not. And so to an Israelite, what the thing was supposed to look like was God is in charge, he's the king, he's the one who gives all the orders, and then there is a leader who is brought up by God for a specific circumstance to be the voice of God for the people to tell them what they need in a specific situation, like a Moses or a Joshua, right? But they were supposed to know what to do in the general sense, day to day, to follow God because he was their king and he had given them the law on Mount Sinai to follow. They did not need a king. The problem is that Israel kept forgetting things. They kept forgetting about God and about what he wanted them to do and how he had told them to follow him. And so they would have this cycle start where, the leader would die and no one had been taught how to follow God. No one had been shown what God wanted. And so about a generation after the leader would die, no one would remember how to follow God anymore, right? And so we kept having this cycle, and you see it most plainly in the book of Judges, where God would have the nation of Israel following him. The leader would die, a generation would pass, they would begin to sin, and then he would raise a judge up from one of the tribes, and that judge would lead the people into battle against whoever was oppressing them. They would be defeated. The leader would then live out the rest of their life. They would die, about a generation would pass, and Israel would forget again, they would sin, and the whole cycle would start over and over and over and over, right? And the thing is, there wasn't a guarantee that the next leader was going to be related to the previous judge. They came from all the different tribes of Israel. Again, there's generational gaps between all of them. And so there's not a whole lot of consistency or longevity to the lineage of a judge. It was just whoever God found in that moment that was needed for the battle that was at hand or for the time in Israel where that judge was needed, right? And so God would select them each time. Well, the judge would die and they would forget everything again. And this became so bad of a pattern and such a just terrible situation in Israel because they would forget things and they would start to do whatever they think is right, that the whole book of Judges ends with this verse, which is not a very hope-filled verse when you read it. It's Judges 21, verse 25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Now, I don't have time to go over all of it with you this morning. I don't have the verses because there's a lot of them. It's like 3 chapters worth in the book of Judges. But I just want to summarize for you what happened to lead to this line. Okay? So you have the whole book of Judges, and then there's this big gap where there's not a judge. And it's there to show you what happens between judges, right? Instead of just saying, well, and Israel sinned again, they wanted to explain this is the crazy stuff that happens, okay? So just a really quick Reader's Digest version for you of what happened before this verse, okay? There's a Levite who has a concubine. That's someone who's not his wife that he gets to sleep with. Not a great thing to start off with, but we're gonna ignore that. We're gonna keep going. He travels to the land of the tribe of Benjamin, who is a tribe of Israel. He stays in this town in Benjamin. Middle of the night, the men from that town come and bang on the door of the house he's staying at and say, hey, we're going to take advantage of you. Get out here. I'm using nice language. They were not going to be nice about it. He says, well, I don't want that to happen to me, so here. And he pushes his concubine out the door and locks it. So they take advantage of her to the point that she dies. So in the morning, he walks out, he opens the door, and she's dead at the doorstep. So he does the only thing that makes logical sense, of course, and he chops her into 12 pieces and sends her to the nations of Israel. Logical was sarcastic, by the way. He sends these 12 pieces of his dead concubine to the nations, or the tribes of Israel, and he says, since when has anything this wicked ever happened in Israel? What are we going to do about this? So the other 11 tribes, the ones that weren't Benjamin, the other 11 tribes get really upset, and they get all their fighting men together, and they go and they kill over 26,000 men in the tribe of Benjamin. And then they make a pact, and they say, hey, we're never, ever again going to give our wives in marriage to the tribe of Benjamin. Or our daughters, sorry, not our wives, although that happened too, but our daughters in marriage to the tribe of Benjamin. Then, a couple of years go by, and the people that weren't at the battle, so like the tribal leaders, the elders, the people that kind of make the decisions that aren't about fighting, they start to feel bad for Benjamin. They say, oh, Benjamin's good people. They messed up once, but they're not awful. We don't need to exclude them from the nation of Israel. Israel needs to have 12 tribes, even though in the law of Moses, what was required of them is that they expel the tribe of Benjamin from among them. Like, they don't get to be a part of the fellowship of Israel anymore. But, oh, we feel bad for them. We don't want to be the bad guy. We don't want to feel that bad. And so what they do is they say, hey, Benjamin, we know that you don't have any wives. You don't have any people to marry, because the rest of the nation won't give you any of their daughters in marriage. We feel bad about that. So remember when we came to battle against you and we gathered all of our fighting men from all of our villages and we came against you? Well, there was one village, they didn't come against you. They didn't come and join the fight, and we think that that's wrong. They should have joined the fight because you guys were bad. But here's what we're going to do. 2 wrongs make a right, so you go and raid that village and take all of their virgin daughters, and those can be your wives. Because that makes logical sense. That's the logical thing, right? Seems great. Great idea. So Benjamin, because again, they weren't the most morally upstanding tribe of Israel, said, okay, sure. And that's what they go do. There's a problem, though. There weren't enough virgin daughters in that town for all of the men in Benjamin. So they still needed wives. So the leaders in the nation of Israel, they felt bad. Still. And they said, well, okay, here's what you can do. Remember how the ark of the Lord and the tabernacle and the priests all live in the town of Shiloh, and how every year there's a huge festival before God, and we make sacrifices, and it's a great time, and we seek the face of God, and we bring our sacrifices to the tabernacle. Well, during that time, a lot of the virgin girls in Shiloh, they go outside of town and they have like a big party. And they celebrate that the festival's in town, and they dance around, and they're, while all the other people, all the men and stuff are in the town doing the stuff that they're supposed to do, they just kind of go and they commune with each other, right? And they're hanging out, and they're kind of having like a, hey, we're the young people type of thing, right? It's kind of like a youth group, but weirder. Why don't you strap on swords again, and while they're doing that, and everybody else is in the town for the sacrifice, why don't you take all of them for wives too? Because, the town where the ark of the Lord is, that's no big deal. It doesn't matter. And, hey, if Shiloh gets upset and they want to fight against you, we're going to come to them and we're going to say, hey, please feel bad for Benjamin. Please don't persecute them because they didn't have any wives. And we told them to do this because this is the only way we can figure out how to make it work where Benjamin doesn't get excommunicated from the nation of Israel. They don't get kicked out. So will you please just let it slide this time and not punish them? Because that makes sense. We turn one sexual assault victim into thousands. And that's supposed to be the morally right thing. And that's the last thing that happens. That ends in verse 24. And then we have verse 25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Now, What you need to know about the Hebrew Bible is that the book of Judges is followed by the book of Samuel. We have 1st and 2nd Samuel. We just split one big book into two. It's one book, one collection. It goes Judges, Samuel. So the author of Judges and Samuel is setting up why Israel has a king and why a king seemed necessary, right? Again, Holy Spirit guiding the author, still a human author with an opinion. He's putting forth a case of this is how bad it was. This is how we needed a king. This is why a king is necessary, right? This is why we need to have a king. This is why we want a king. Because every time the judge dies, we forget things and we do whatever we think is right, and it goes terribly. And this stuff happened. And so we wanted a king. Here's what's interesting. First king of Israel is Saul. You know what tribe Saul was from? Benjamin. So God, in his infinite wisdom, when the nation begins to ask for a king, he gives them a warning, right? So the last judge is Samuel. Samuel is born and becomes a judge after this section of Judges, right? So Judges, the book ends. It's terrible. There's no direction. Samuel is born. He's raised up. He becomes a judge and a prophet in Israel. He's doing a great job, but his kids aren't doing a great job. There's a pattern there, right? Judge does a great job. People that come after the judge don't do that good of a job. They don't follow God. They're not the love for God is not passed down. Okay? And so Samuel is approached by the nation of Israel and they say, hey, your sons don't really follow God the way you follow God. We want a king, like all the nations around us have a king, where his kids sit on the throne after him, and we have a set lineage of people that we can look to for leadership and to fight our battles and to guide us. And Samuel tells God, they're asking for a king. And God gives them a warning. And this is the crazy thing, is that the idea of kings oppressing people, it's not foreign to the Bible. It's pretty normal for kings, actually. And God even says this in the warning. 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 10. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king from him. He said, these will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots, and he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his servants. He will take the tenth of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and to his servants. He will take your male servants and female servants and the best of your young men and your donkeys and put them to his work. He will take the tenth of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. But the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, but there shall be a king over us, that we may also be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. God's given him a warning. He's like, listen, all these kings around you, they're not great leaders. They oppress their people. They take from their people. That is what's going to happen to you. King's going to be terrible. He's going to oppress you, and you're going to cry out because of the oppression to me. But you picked him. This is not some other nation coming and invading you that I'm going to deliver you from. You picked him, and so you're stuck, and I'm not going to listen to you. But they're stubborn, and they say, no, we want a king. We want a king. But God knew that this was going to happen. God knew, and he set standards for what a king should be and how a king should be elected. They just refused to follow them. See, because he knew that they weren't going to be able to follow him as just as the figurehead, right? As God being at the top, because he's not a human. They can't see him. And they've already, when Moses was getting the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, had sat there and made an idol out of gold and turned it into a calf and said, no, this is our God, because we can see it and touch it and make sacrifices before it. He knew that their loyalty was eventually going to wane on him and to him, and he knew that they were going to look for a human flesh and blood leader to follow. He knew they were going to ask for a king. all the way back before they had even entered the promised land. And he told Moses what those requirements were going to be. In Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 14, he says, when you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me, you may indeed set a king over you whom the Lord your God will choose. God is allowing their disloyalty because he knows that they're weak. He knows that their loyalty is not cemented on him. And so he's allowing it, right? So he lays out these qualifications, right? So he says, the Lord your God will choose, though. That's important, right? You're going to have a king. I'll let you have a king, but I need to choose him. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law approved by the Levitical priests, and it shall be with him, and he shall read it in all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes, and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment either to the right hand or to the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. That was a lot. But these were the standards. These were the requirements of a king. He was going to be single-minded. He was going to be devoted to the Lord. He was going to write his own personal copy of the law of Moses. Right? So the first 5 books of the Bible, he's going to write them, handwritten in a book that he is going to study himself day and night so that he knows it backwards and forwards, upside down, and he knows what God wants for the people. So in summary, what is God looking for in this king, right? So if we can kind of boil these things down to the principles, we come up with a couple, right? So the first one is this: a king after God's heart seeks to serve as a leader, not enslave as a ruler, right? He's not going to set himself above his brothers. He's not going to seek to have many horses. He's not going to try and have this huge army and go and fight everybody. He's not going to try and be this great military leader. What he's trying to do is be a servant leader. This is actually reflected in the language of Hebrew. The Israelite kings, as opposed to all the other kings, they are called Nagid, which is the term for a servant king, a servant leader, right? All of the other nations, when their kings are talked about, the term Melech is used, which is like demigod, sovereign, deity, because a lot of those cultures viewed their kings that way, like they were part of the pantheon of the gods, right? And so Nagid is the Israelites' king. He is a servant of the people. He is about the good of the people. He is understanding that he's one of the people, right? And then a king after God's heart upholds God's moral standards in the land. He is going to know the law of God. He is going to then push the law of God to the borders of Israel and make sure that that is what is followed. Right? And so because he is responsible for the moral standards in the land, that means he is also bearing the responsibility of the people that he serves. So if there's a tribe like Benjamin that errs so grievously, and he's the king, he knows what the law requires, and he's going to make sure that the law is carried out. And then he's also going to make sure that he is exemplifying those characteristics that God is looking for, not only in the nation, but personally. He's a servant leader, right? Follow him as he's following God. Follow him as he seeks the Lord, as he reveres the Lord's name. But then they end up with King Saul first. Because what God does is he lets them pick. Because they say, we will set a king over us who is like the other nations. And so they cast lots. And it didn't surprise God. God had already told Samuel what was going to happen. In fact, Samuel had already told Saul what was going to happen. But the people cast lots, and the lot fell to Saul. And he looked like the kings from all the other nations. He's tall, he's big, he's a fighter, he's handsome. But his heart wasn't for God. His will wasn't bent to the will of God. He wanted to do it his way. He did what he thought was best in his own eyes. Right? They're going to fight. This is early in his kingship. He hasn't been king very long. They're going to fight the Philistines. One of hundreds of times that they have a skirmish with the Philistines, and Samuel tells them, wait on me. After 7 days, I'm going to come. We're going to make a sacrifice. We're going to seek the Lord. Ask him what we're supposed to do. Saul doesn't wait. He makes the sacrifice himself because Samuel seemed to be late. What the language notates is in the seemed to be late is really what it means is that it was late in the seventh day. The seventh day wasn't completed yet. It was just getting late, right? The afternoon was coming to a close. It was almost evening. And Saul thought that Samuel wasn't coming, and so Saul went ahead and made the sacrifice. And as soon as he made the sacrifice, guess who shows up? Samuel. He never waited for Samuel to show up. And he never really sought God's direction for the battle. He had already mustered the troops, told them what they were going to do, made a strategy. Really, he was waiting on Samuel as a courtesy to Samuel because they were friends. Samuel loved Saul. But Samuel had to deliver to Saul the punishment for what he was doing. And so Samuel actually gives him this almost psalm poem statement about the character of God and what God is looking for in a king as he is telling Saul, hey, the kingdom is going to be taken away from you. And we find that in 1 Samuel 15, verse 22. It says, and Samuel said, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and presumption is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. Listen to that. Rebellion is as the sin of divination, meaning that God, divination, seeking the counsel of demons and witchcraft to try and determine the future and the outcomes and what's going to happen, is just like that's bad. So is rebellion. Rebellion is just as bad, meaning if you rebel against what God has told you, it's just as bad, right? And then presumption is just as bad, right? Presumption is just as bad as idolatry, which is like the first commandment in the 10 Commandments. Saul presumed to know best, which Israel has been doing for hundreds of years at this point. He presumed to know best, and he made the sacrifice. And this isn't even the first time that he's heard that the kingdom is being taken away from him, right? This is after he's lost some battles, and he goes to Samuel, and he's like, what's going on? And Samuel reminds him. The first time that Samuel tells him is the one that's in the bumper video. 1 Samuel 13:14, it says, but now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. Benjamin, who did what they thought was right, living in Israel, who thought they knew what was right, elected a Benjamite, Saul, to be king, who did things the way he thought was right. And God says, you got to pick. Now let me contrast what you picked with my choice. Right? And why was David the right choice to be king? We look to the Apostle Paul. As he's speaking in Acts chapter 13, he talks about David, and he says, and when he removed him, being Saul, he raised up David to be their king, of whom he testified and said, I have found in David the son of Jesse a man after my heart, who will do all my will. All my will. Meaning that a king after God's heart is completely dedicated to the whole will of God. The whole will of God. Not just part of it, not just the part that you agree with, not just the part that you think sounds good, but the whole will of God. So if God says to go do something, and that might make things tight, or some people in Israel make them mad at you, and you're not going to be popular with that tribe because of the things you're doing, because you're upholding the law of God, and he's told you to do it, you're going to do it anyway. You're not trying to play favorites. You're not trying to do what the elders of Israel did with Benjamin and not be the bad guy. You're okay with being the bad guy as long as you're the right guy with God. Because you're after the whole will of God. And that's who David was. David is elected king, and for 7.5 years, he doesn't even rule the whole of Israel. He just rules the tribe of Judah, because Abner, who was Saul's military commander, took Saul's last remaining son, heir, Ishbosheth, and set him up as a king. right? Now, Abner's really controlling the thing, but Ishbosheth is sitting on the throne. They're having a civil war, basically. And David is trying to work it out with them by talking. Amazing, right? Using words. He's not going out to kill them. He's trying to talk to them. But his commander, Joab, tricks Abner and Ishbosheth, and they end up being killed. And David mourns. He mourns the loss of life. He mourns that Israelites killed the Israelites. He mourns the death of the king and the king's family that he served and that he loved. He did love Saul. Later, David brings Jonathan, his best friend, Saul's son. He brings Jonathan's son, Mephibosheth, who can't walk, and lets him live in the palace and eat at his table for the rest of his life. He's not trying to eradicate Saul's lineage because he's following the will of God. He moves the capital to Jerusalem, which is more central to all of Israel. And once he does that, he's trying to move the Ark of the Covenant, where it's the presence of God, which has been sitting on the borders of Israel for years because the Philistines took it in a battle. He's trying to move it, and so he moves it to Jerusalem and has this big party and makes all these sacrifices and throws this huge celebration as the Ark is brought into Jerusalem. Because he cares about the Lord and he reveres the Lord's name and he honors the Lord's name. He has a heart after God. And he's leading the people of Israel in making sure that the law of God is what is upheld in the nation, that the law of God is what he is following, that the name of the Lord is revered among all of the people except in one place, his family. His family. And it starts well before David's published sins, where the Bible makes a big deal out of what he does, right? It's well before Bathsheba. It's well before he takes a census. It's well before a lot of things that happen later in David's reign as king. It starts when he starts taking multiple wives, which in Deuteronomy 17, God said he shall not multiply wives or horses or gold. And then those wives begin to have kids. And he has all these children. And as we read, even before the sin with Bathsheba, even before that child dies, and then they have other children, he has kids that he's not teaching to follow God. Well, how do we know that? Because in 2 Samuel, it shows that they are uncontrolled, they're undisciplined, and they're led by their vices. Now, again, you and I can be just like that, right? But remember that David's whole job as the king of Israel is to lead all of the people, including his family, in the worship, the reverence, and loyalty to God. But that doesn't happen in his household. What happens in his household? Well, his oldest son, Amnon, sexually assaults his stepsister, Tamar. David, instead of punishing Amnon, was going to have Tamar marry him so that it wouldn't look weird. But then Amnon decides he doesn't want Tamar anymore, so he kicks her out. So Tamar's brother, Absalom, devises a plan and murders Amnon. Does David punish Absalom for the death of Amnon? Does he bring any kind of discipline? Does he talk to them about what God wants? Not at all. Absalom runs and David just kind of lets him go. He mourns for the death of his son, but he doesn't bring any discipline. It gets so bad to the point that Absalom is able to usurp David's throne, get the people of Israel to actually question David's leadership. And eventually David is run out of Jerusalem. And it takes the death of Absalom before David is able to be back on his own throne. David loved his children, but David did not lead his children. And you've heard Kenny say it 100 times, probably 1,000 times at this point. The church is 25 years old, right? He says values are more caught than taught. In David's situation, both were missing. Now, again, how that happens, the Bible doesn't say, right? But with multiple families, dozens of children, and he's fighting in battles, and he's out running from Saul during the early parts of their life, and then when he's king, he's leading the army in battle. He's probably not home a lot. He's also not teaching them or having them taught in the ways of God. And there is no discipline when they do step out of line. All of the things that as a king he's supposed to be doing for the entire nation of Israel. So he loved God. He obeyed God. He listened to God, but he didn't teach his kids to do the same thing. And if there's one thing we can take from David as king, as the leader, as the one responsible for the people of Israel, that we can take into today and apply to our lives now, it's this. It's that King Jesus wants leaders who faithfully listen, obey, and show others the way to do that. Right? That's our call in the Great Commission. We are to go and make disciples. So we're learning how to follow Jesus, and as we follow Jesus, we teach other people how to follow Jesus. We teach other people how to obey the voice of God, how to hear the voice of God, how to do what he says, how to love him, how to put him above everything else, how to prioritize him. That's the call of disciple making. That's the call of the Great Commission. That was the call for the king. But so often we make the error that David made, that all of Israel made, all throughout their history, which is we will not pass on what God has asked of us. We will not make discipleship a priority. It's not just a household thing. The Great Commission isn't just for your family. The Great Commission is for everyone. Discipleship should be a priority for all of our lives as we go, wherever we go. But see, the issue becomes that it's hard, that we don't like accountability, that when we see someone out of line, we go, oh, you know what, it's not really my place. You know, you could be a friend. You go to church together. You see them doing something that you know you should probably talk to them about, but you're not going to say anything because they got to figure it. You know, it's them and Jesus. They got, you know, that's their own thing. The Holy Spirit's got to take care of that, convict them, whatever. Yeah, that's kind of why he has the church. It's the hands and feet of Jesus. The nation of Israel didn't want to kick Benjamin out. Saul didn't want to wait on Samuel. David did not want to punish and discipline his sons for their sins. Loved them, but didn't lead them. And listen, I get it. I'm a dad. And it is heartbreaking when I have to discipline my 18-month-old, and he cries, and he looks at me with tears running down his face, and he's like, why did you do that, right? He's 18 months, so he doesn't really get the whole, like, why it's happening thing. He just knows that he wasn't supposed to do it, and he did. And now there's consequences, and so he looks, tears running down his face, and he wants a hug, and he's like, that hurt, or that wasn't fun, or I don't like this, right? And then my older kids, it's not as much, spanking or discipline like that anymore. It's like grounding, and you can't go see friends, and you can't, play video games, or you can't watch TV, or you can't go do whatever the thing is that you wanted to go do because you didn't do what you said, or you said something that you shouldn't have, or you did something that you weren't supposed to. And man, that you see it on their faces when they realize the consequences of their own choice, right? They're like, I don't like this. I don't like what my choices have brought upon me. And so then it becomes a bartering thing. Please, 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 I'll never do it again. Please, I swear, just let me go. Let me go to my friend's house. Please, I'll never do it again. I'm so sorry. You're right. I shouldn't have. Please, take away the consequence. Let me go. It's not fun, but it is necessary. It's not fun to see the heartbreak on my children's faces when I have to actually hold to my guns, right? But it's necessary. Because what we're trying to do in our household is we're not only trying to listen and obey Jesus as best as we can, but my wife and I are also trying to teach our kids how to do that too. And if we show them that they don't actually have to listen and obey us because we don't actually bring any consequences when they don't, then when they turn 18 or when they're 25 and they're on their own, how in the world are they going to do that to God? How are they going to listen and obey Jesus or teach anyone else to do the same if they didn't actually ever have to do that for anybody else because we just showed them that consequences don't actually exist? Not only is life going to punch them in the face really fast, but beyond that, like, he's God. I want my children to grow up with a healthy fear and reverence for the fact that he's the creator of the universe. And for us to do anything other than what he wants is really dumb on our part and dangerous and sinful. But if they never have to listen to me and there's never any consequences for anything that goes wrong, and we just fix it and take away all of that like Israel did for Benjamin, right? Then we're just doing whatever we think is right. Whatever feels, oh man, we love our kids. They're good kids. They didn't mean to do it. Well, yeah, they did. Yeah, they did. Start yelling at you, they mean to do that. Everybody can choose the words that come out of their mouth. And so then our job is to be Samuel speaking to Saul. Hey, there are consequences, and here's what they are. Instead of David, who didn't discipline his kids and ended up losing them both. And again, it's not just a family thing, but I'm a dad, so I'm using something that I know. It's every type of discipleship. If you're discipling a coworker, if you're trying to reach a coworker for the kingdom of Jesus, they're going to be watching you as you follow Jesus. And you should be teaching them how to do the same thing, right? The word go in the English, like in the Great Commission, right? In Greek, it's as you are going. So as you live your life, you're making disciples. It's not that you have to go somewhere foreign to where you are. It's as you are going about your day, as you are going about your household, as you are going about your job, make disciples. Right? And make no mistake, the church is the way that Israel should have always been. Jesus is the head. Jesus is the king. He's the leader. We're on a level playing field. We're all just trying to follow him and teach other people to do that too. That's what we're called to do. That's what David, as the imperfect king, was missing, and that's what Jesus came to show us how to do as the Messiah, as the anointed one, as the perfect king. He says, hey, I've got this figured out. I'm going to pay for all of this, and what you're going to do is you're going to teach other people how to follow me like I'm telling you to follow me. It's how the church started. It's how the church is going to keep going. It's how this place is going to keep going. Is we have to listen, we have to obey, and then we have to show other people to do the same thing. That's our job, but it's also our joy. Less regret, more fulfillment. God really does know better than us. And I have to check myself on that all the time. Right? I don't know better than God. I don't know why I pretend to. But I have to check myself all the time and remind myself that he's in control. He knows better. Doing it his way is best. As my kids are watching me do that, it's important. Let's pray.